Right. Welcome, everyone, to the future of work. How can we evolve from eat, work, sleep, repeat? Sounds familiar to many of us, doesn't it? So let's kick this off. Thank you for tuning in. This session aims to cover how we really stay creative, resilient, and dare I say it, happy during a continued phase where face to face and normal human contact has been replaced by talking to our screens. So I'm Shivi Jervis, a futurologist focusing on human-centered innovation that's underpinned by consumer psychology. And the vast majority of the time, I do keynotes and masterclasses, but the great folks over at the London Speaker Bureau are aware that I absolutely love the dynamic of a two-way dialogue. And they've given me a phenomenal guest in our virtual hot seat today. Speaking of dialogue, by the way, I wonder if any of you have heard of this research that finds we all have far more conversations in our heads with ourselves than we actually do with other people. Think about it. I think it's quite true. So let's get straight to it. Today, we're in conversation with the brilliant Bruce Daisley. He is Twitter's former European VP and author of the best selling book, Eat, Sleep, Work, Repeat. A very apt title for our state of play these days. Bruce, welcome to our hot seat.
Thank you. Thank you for having me today.
So, Bruce, I know many of us can actually feel quite a bit of Zoom fatigue, right? But our job, you and I, will be to perhaps give those watching a high octane, high energy 20 or 30 minutes that will hopefully energize minds. And I've no doubt we can do that. To everyone, just before we kick off, please make sure that you use the Q&A option, which is already open now. This is different to the regular chat window. So we're specifically using the Q&A tab on the bottom of your screen, and then we'll pick them up at the end of the first 20 minutes. We only have 10 minutes for questions, so the sooner you get your questions in, the better. So, Bruce, my first question for you. You've written a best-selling book on workplace culture. You think about this day in and out. Admittedly, though, it is easier to do some of this team bonding, for instance, in person. And given the scenario we're in with work, how do we keep these notions of community and connection relevant, alive, and maintain cohesion in teams?
Yeah, well, look, this is the fundamental question. I think what a lot of people are finding is that they've sort of gone through different stages of trying to work out what the new version of work looks like, largely because we're interpreting what's going on in front of us right now, trying to work out what of this is just cyclical, changing because by necessity, and how much of this is structural. Have we transitioned into a different way of working? And it begs the question then that if we have changed, in what sense will what we knew before stay the same? So look, I'll look into some data and then I'll talk specifically about what you said there. Anyone who uses Twitter, there was a Twitter thread last week that was going everywhere. That was, it ended up in newspapers. It was everywhere about a guy who sells remote working products, talking about the office is dead. And he said 70% of what we know of office space is going to disappear. The interesting thing is that really isn't borne out by the evidence. So when we look into the big evidence that comes from big reputable organizations like PwC have done some work, KPMG have done some work. When we look into their research, it suggests that about 88% of us want to carry on working in the office in some capacity. The critical thing is that most people are saying they've enjoyed this yin yang. They've enjoyed getting to know the names of the people they share a house with. Turns out that these youngsters aren't too bad. They've enjoyed maybe going to local shops and things like that. And so to some extent, they want to keep 2 days a week working from home. And so I think this is one of the fundamental things. Most firms recognize that we're going to have probably 1 or 2 days a week working from home in the future. And the really fundamental thing, you mentioned us feeling part of something. The really fundamental thing is that we shouldn't make the mistake when we're planning for, let's be optimistic, when we're planning for September, we shouldn't make the mistake of thinking that somehow we can allow this to really sort of settle and sort itself out. What do we know from the remote only firms, the firms that went remote previously? A lot of them went remote by accident. And they did it because they would say to people, firms like Basecamp, who are a software development firm, they would say, feel free to work from home whenever you want. What happens is we make that arduous commute in, we go and do things that feel nostalgic now, like buy our Pret sandwich and our coffee. We get to our desk and we realize none of our colleagues are there. And the next time you're debating spending £30 getting into central London or however long your commute is, next time we're debating that, we say to ourselves, you know, I might just stay at home. And I think that's the fundamental thing. The office has a network effect. And I think a lot of us, as we're thinking about September and that glorious reunification, getting everyone together, creating that team dynamic where people feel part of something is going to be a really critical part of what we're creating. So what we know is that 88% of people, we do want some of that collective energy. Brené Brown calls it collective effervescence, how we feel sort of more energized when we're around other people. I think we do want some of that. That's what we've missed. But on the other hand, I think most of us recognize there's some really good research from an organization called Leesman. And Leesman say that in terms of productivity, in terms of getting our job done, almost without exception, there's one group that's the exception, almost without exception, people feel that they can get their job done better at home than they can at work. It's really interesting. The one exception is worth calling out. They are bosses, people who used to have a corner office of their own. They felt they could get their job done much better in an office because all their many helpers were arranged in desks around them. So they're the only people who've said the new option of work isn't as effective. But I think for a lot of us, we are missing that, as you describe it, team cohesion, that sense of feeling part of something.
Yeah, that feeling of camaraderie, isn't it? And,
Yeah.
personally, Bruce, you and I go back. I was at Telefonica as a head of digital when you were at Twitter. And literally, we were in the same building at 20 Air Street in Piccadilly Circus. And I remember, at that point itself, Telefonica, for instance, the guys at O2 were very progressive, as were Twitter. Many of us, to be honest, were only in the office X amount of days. And, if we had an offsite, we didn't have to always come into the office after that. But then my husband was a Credit Suisse, it's never been an option to work from home. This was, a fascinating new world for him when it all opened up. And you're absolutely right. I think firms have now discovered actually people can be more productive. It's the same notion we use even when we have toddlers or nursery going children, where the school will say, if your kids are not happy and secure, they're not going to be productive. Well, that's the same for us as grown-ups, isn't it? And hopefully being at home means you feel just a little bit more relaxed. But yes, you miss that camaraderie. So speaking of culture, Bruce, there's the aspect in one's mindset about when neuroscience comes into this as well. What makes our brains actually tick, how well we can adopt some of these ways of working, these innovations. So if you could debunk for me and for those watching, perhaps some of the psychology behind, for instance, a mindset of one trait or factor that many of us want to understand and do better for our mental well-being and work outcomes. And I'm talking about resilience. So what does resilience look like in different shapes and forms? And have we been approaching it perhaps in a wrong way all the while?
Yeah, well, I'm right in the middle right now of writing a book on resilience. And the really interesting thing about resilience is that as soon as you start hearing the phrase, you recognize that we're hearing the phrase more now than ever before. If you have a look, Google run this this Ngrams thing, which looks at the amount of mentions of certain words in books. And the word resilience is about 5 times more common now than it was 5 years ago. So it's definitely a trending topic in terms of what we're thinking about. And generally what we hear when we hear resilience is that it's an invocation to other people to be resilient. So one example I can give you, I was on a radio radio show about 4 or 5 months ago, and Robert Peston was one of the guests, and at the time we were right in the midst of that really unenviable situation where loads of A-level students had their whole life in school upended and they had bad results. And Robert Peston used a classic use of the word resilience. He said it's time for teenagers to be a bit more resilient. And this is generally the way that we see the word. Resilience is always directed at other people. Other people need to be more resilient. I had someone come around to fix my Wi-Fi, in fact, and he said to me, he was chatting away, and he said he was talking about calming down. You know, that sense that when you're in a moment of stress, anxiety, you have a bad moment. And he said, never in the history of calming down has someone calmed down by being asked to calm down. And I thought that's workman logic, that's workman wisdom. There's some beauty in that. And but I thought there's an interesting comparison with resilience. Never in the history of resilience Has someone been resilient because Robert Peston told them to be resilient? And what you find about resilience is that it's actually a collective trait rather than an individual one. We generally see resilient communities. We draw upon the strength of those around us when we feel resilient. What you generally discover is there's a series of aspects of resilience. First one is control. Control in the whole of psychology is almost the single most important thing. When we feel a lexus of control, when we feel like we're in charge of our situation, we feel more resilient, our well-being is higher. And that's especially relevant right now, because a lot of us sometimes open our electronic calendar in the morning and we sort of gasp because we see that we've got 7 hours of video calls and we've got these emails and someone's requesting a meeting for us at lunchtime, and we scream, how am I going to get anything done? And that's a lot of us are feeling, even though we've got these high responsibility jobs, these high autonomy jobs, we don't feel in control of our situation. So if you've ever had that breathlessness, ever had that sense of how am I going to get anything done, that's because an absence of control is really impressing itself upon you. The other two elements of control are about identity, recognizing that we feel part of something that we feel complete with, and that might be, I really value the people that I work with. I really value my personal identity and that the fact it's respected. My identity might be defined by my class, my ethnicity, my nationality, or it might be just defined by the way that I perceive myself in the world. But these are really important things for our well-being. And the final element of resilience that we often neglect, but I think we're witnessing right now, is the sense of community, sense of feeling part of something bigger than ourselves. Really good evidence on this. People who suffer depression, people who suffer heart attacks, people who suffer illness, their speed of recovery is largely correlated with the amount of community they feel part of and the amount of groups they report feeling connected into. And we often neglect it, but that sense of feeling part of something bigger than ourselves is the thing what a few of us are missing right now in terms of the way that we're working, the way that we're living. So I did some work last summer, just looking into how some companies are creating community managers. And they're thinking, I sat down with, or I had a Zoom call with one organization's community manager. I said to her, so how do you create community in these times? And she said, well, look, it's not about creating a single community across our 500 employees. It's about knowing that if we create 30 different communities, people will feel that their community sits inside the organization. So that might be runners at the company. It might be parents. It might be people from different ethnicities. It might be people from different sexualities. But as long as they feel that their identity sits inside the whole of the organization, it's a really important part of belonging there. So, control, identity, community. I think quite often we make the mistake of thinking resilience is like a switch that, if you're not resilient, it's because you didn't want to be resilient. You didn't switch it on. And actually far more, it's about, if a firm's saying we want our employees to be more resilient, what they should be saying is, how can we enable our employees to be more resilient? I think it's a fundamental mistake that rather than Robert Peston instructing someone to be resilient, we need to be saying, how can we enable people to be resilient?
Yeah, exactly. Create those catalyzing forces that allow someone to actually do that. So Bruce, I'm actually going to pull in a question from the live Q&A, and we'll do this one really quickly if we may, because we've got two other really meaty ones to go through. And this one is from Angela Rigby, and it's specifically on resilience. So her question is, Bruce, are you saying that we aren't in control of our thoughts and emotions when we're not being resilient?
Rather more. So let's go into the importance of control. The importance of control, I guess, to some extent, if you want to be simplistic about it, you could put it on a line. And quite often, control is placed at one end and helplessness is placed at the other end. And what we witness is that the way that we perceive the world largely depends on where we sit on that scale. So if we believe that events are outside our control, and we believe that effectively we're sort of bobbing and weaving and bobbing in the ocean, and we have no say over it, what you generally discover is that people's well-being is measurably worse. And so when people feel like they're in control of their situation, that the actions that they're taking have an impact on various aspects of their life, their well-being is higher and their resilience is higher. And this can go to really simplistic levels. Let me give you some examples. Nurses, here's the remarkable thing about this. So nurses who do really long shifts, if the nurses feel that they have decided to do those long shifts, and it might be because they really feel that it's a difficult time right now, or they're earning more money and they're saving for something, or they know that they've chosen to do it. If they elect to do those longer shifts, when we look at their well-being is higher than when they feel forced. So effectively, those tiny little moments of control, the sense that I've chosen to do this, and it's, you might see this illustrated. I often have people come up to me who've worked in startups or worked in their own companies, and they say, you talk about energy being finite, you talk about there being only a certain amount of energy we can bring to things. But when I was really committed to my startup, when I was really committed to this project, I just could have gone and gone and gone and gone. And that's what you discover when we bring our own will, our own initiative to it. It does seem to unlock some additional incremental resource. Now, that's not to say we won't eventually be exhausted, but we do seem to have some contribution. When we feel in control, it does contribute, and that by extension contributes to our resilience. So generally, when you look at people who are exhibiting an absence of resilience, they often exhibit that helplessness. They exhibit anxiety. They feel like they don't have control over situations. And, that's why I bring that back to the way that a lot of us are working right now. We don't have control because we can't go and see people. We don't have control because our calendars are sort of, they don't give us the option to decline half the things we're in. We don't have control. We can't surround ourselves with more people to energize us. And so as a consequence of that, it is having an impact on our well-being.
Yeah, very eloquently put. And you're absolutely right. I think just knowing that control is not, because sometimes the word control has a negative connotation, isn't it? Sort of, you think of people who are controlling of others as not necessarily pleasant people, but having a sense of control over yourself doesn't mean you're an uptight person who needs everything to go their way. It simply means, as you say, being able to do something of your own volition, to be able to shape outcomes and what you do with your time or who you spend it with. And both those things pretty much out of our control right now. I feel that frustration on a daily basis. So Bruce, let's shift back just a little. I often hear that certain organizations or let's say people are just seen as more creative than others. And so this act of behaving creatively can sometimes also be seen as something that a very cool media agency person does, or a startup founder does, or something that is maybe more for the entertainment sector, or someone working in broadcasting. We don't always associate big doses of creativity with, for instance, if you think of an engineering firm or manufacturing, I've had people go, what? Creativity in manufacturing? And yet there are quite a few of those instances. What does it really take to stoke and tease out a creative state of mind in people, regardless of industry?
Yeah, I mean, generally the thing about creativity is that broadly the question is not what you're doing to enable it, but what you're doing to stop it. Because we generally find that our brains go into problem solving mode, which is a form of creativity, the moment that a challenge is presented to us. And largely the thing that prevents us from going into that solutioneering, that it's swashbuckling sense of coming up with ideas, is when someone says there's a prohibition on doing it that way. You can't do it that way. You can't do it that way. Generally, it's only when we're instructed that we start narrowing down our creativity. What you discover from the firms who enable creativity in their organization, they set time aside for it, and they really try to celebrate it and nurture it. When I was at Twitter, we used to have a biennial Hack Week, and there's a real fondness for Hack Weeks at Twitter, largely because Twitter itself, about 15 years ago, was created in a Hack Week. It was a podcasting company called Odeo. Overnight, Apple introduced podcasting as a feature on Apple phones as part of iTunes, and so Odeo had no business overnight, and so they created little teams where they said, right, go and come up with a new business. And a team of Biz Stone and Jack Dorsey came up with an idea of texting all of your friends from a single device. You could send a short code message and it would text all of your friends' device before mobile phones had internet everywhere, which seems like a different lifetime. But but we used to have Hack Weeks twice a year. And they were all about that. We chose weeks where, it might be the week just before Christmas or the week just after Christmas, where people were feeling, a bit either end of termy or start of termy, week in the middle, just before people were going on summer holidays, to just try and give a bit of the creative energy and outlet. And what you discover is that there's a really interesting thing when you look into the origin of creativity. Creativity often sits far closer to the parts of our brain that are associated with daydreaming, of boredom, something called the default network, the default mode. What you discover is that when we go into these daydreamy states, that's when you're far more likely to have a really interesting idea when you're sort of staring out the window, when you're waiting for the kettle to boil, when you're sitting waiting for someone. You're far more likely to have this random suggestion than when you're staring into your phone. And so it's really interesting when we activate that default mode. It seems to be one of the best places that we could create invention. Now, of course, back to the fact that so many of us live in sort of abeyance to our calendars. A lot of us just don't have time on our calendar to daydream, to have this default mode thinking. So I think, really interesting thing, organizations that generally have more creativity have more slack in the system. They allow their teams to have a bit of reflection time, a bit of imagination time.
The building in downtime actually within your work sphere, rather than downtime being seen as something you only do when you clock off and you're on your way home and you go, right, that's when you can actually relax now. You're allowed to relax now. But actually, I love the idea of building that in to the everyday session. And yeah, you're absolutely right. It's when I was sort of eating my lovely spicy Korean food at my desk when I was at Telefonica, sort of just staring off, not looking at my phone. My neurotransmitters could calm down a little bit and have that breathing room that I went, oh, what about ... You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
And your brain's inundated. It's very hard to bring that out. So Bruce, we're at 10:22. And I'm actually going to dive straight into Q&A because we've got some great questions. So there is one from Aman Singh, and they say the future of work is pretty much the now of work, which has resulted in multitasking and Zoom fatigue. What are some of the best ways to manage time and work along with having some sort of a personal space? So maybe sort of 2 or 3 quick fire tips.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's going to be a big discussion about organizations that start thinking about can they do things in different ways. And we often see that when organizations start doing things differently, we spot that initially this lives in the fringes, and then it starts becoming more and more common, more and more popular. These quite often it's the subversive thinkers then that you need to follow. There's a computer scientist professor at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., called Cal Newport, who's written a couple of sort of big selling books, one called Deep Work, one called Digital Minimalism. He's got a book coming out in March, which is called A World Without Email. And I was very fortunate that I know Cal, and he's given me the preview copy of this. And he talks about, so firstly, the idea of a world without email. I guess we should mark that with a lot of the firms who are remote only. They say something that seems equally heretical. They say they regard meetings as a last resort. Hang on, a world without email and meetings as a last resort. How on earth do these companies do their business? And that's what the fundamental difference. This is why this lives in the fringes at the moment, is because if we didn't have email and we didn't have Zoom calls, that's my whole day. And what you discover is that these people say, actually, what we find is that when we invite someone to jump on a call, we're filling time, it's exhausting, it uses an imprecision of information. And actually, we could do it a lot more effectively. One of the tools that Cal Newport talks about is he talks about digital whiteboards and project boards and things like Trello, things like Basecamp, that allow people to contribute irrespective of the time. So that's sometimes called asynchronously. Irrespective of the time, they can contribute to saying where they are on different parts of a project. And so whether that will hit mainstream or not, I think what you will find is a lot of organizations will say, firstly, when we go back to the office, that they preferred some of the ways that team meetings work when everyone is on their screen. Because one of the things we're going to have to encounter when we go back to the office is, okay, if I go into the office on Monday and Thursday and you're at home on those days, then do I dial into a meeting and you're on the big screen and there's 6 people in the room and 12 people on screens? What we discovered very quickly is that those hybrid video calls aren't very satisfying. I don't know if you ever did one in the old days, but it just felt like there was a sort of a big God face on a screen and everyone else was having their chat in the room. It's very unsatisfying. So
It's quite disjointed. Yeah, absolutely.
yeah, I suspect a lot of us will say, you know what, we actually prefer some status meetings where everyone's on the screen. Interesting. So what will the office be for? Well, it might be for those one-to-ones. We prefer to do those together, or it might be for brainstorm meetings, or it might be for team bonding occasions. But I think it will force us to be honest about the units of creation and the units of productivity. So I think we're going to go into, far from this being the end of the story, I think we're going to go into a lot of really fascinating working out from here on in. And firms are going to have to work out, how do you stop the office being a status symbol? So
exactly. Yeah.
We've all witnessed the fact that actually, for the sense of feeling like we can get our job done, feeling like we can be more connected with our other personalities, actually having a couple of days a week seems like something that we want to continue. But if we realize that every time we're on a video call, the office SWAT sitting next to the boss in the office, we're going to start thinking, oh man, do I need to go into work every day so that I look like I'm bringing an apple for the teacher as well?
Yeah.
And so if we're not careful, that's right. So we need to be really deliberate. What does the version of work that we want to create look like? And I think that's the really exciting thing for firms who say we want to create a really special culture here. They're going to have to pose some of these interesting questions. Do we use email too much? Do we use Zoom too much? And answering those questions, I think, is potentially going to be a really energizing way to create a new version of a work culture that feels really positive, creative.
Absolutely. And in fact, Bruce, to that point, I will paraphrase someone's question, because the question in some ways has been answered, but as a comment, and it's Susan Tamang who says, when we work from home, I've noticed we feel guilty that we're not putting in as much as we used to as work. Think of the dedicated time at work. And actually, this ends up driving us to work longer hours or having to be less productive and neglect things at home, such as housework or family time. And that's a really good point. I know that many of us feel that every day. And we have a final 2 minutes. So in 2 minutes or less, Bruce, I have a really great question for you. It's something a lot of people think of no matter what stage they're in their career. Networking and mentoring have been fundamental to my career, asks China Moore. For those early on in their career, what advice would you give them when working virtually? How do we make this mentoring system and networking happen? And I imagine, China, it must feel a bit stressful that if you look out for a mentor, you're now asking them to give you yet another half hour or 45 minutes of another virtual Zoom call, infringing on their time. Whereas in person, it's so much different when you're catching up over coffee. Bruce, any tips? And we have 2 minutes left.
Okay, so first thing is, we shouldn't presume that we can always substitute digitally some of the wonders of human presence and human energy. I'm always fascinated with some of the evidence which suggests that when you put people exercising next to each other, their endorphin levels and their pleasure hormone levels are higher by them exercising next to each other. If you've ever run alongside someone or done something alongside someone and hit a personal best, the thing you might ask yourself is, why can't my watch do that for me? Why can't something in my ears do that for me? Why? Because there's something atavistic, there's something programmed into our DNA that when we're around other people, things are different. So we shouldn't try to substitute what face-to-face interactions do for us. We shouldn't try to create some sort of digital version. We're never going to do it. What we should be doing, though, is thinking about that is the one thing when I return to the office, when I get the opportunity to return, that's one of the things that I'm going to be most intentional about. I adore a guy called Casper ter Kuile, who is a community expert, and he talks about the importance of rituals. I think, what he would say is when we do go back to the office, that big first team meal is far more important than you might imagine. You might think, I haven't got time, I haven't got childcare. That first team meal where you break bread together, you sit around the table together, and it might be mid-afternoon over a plate of sandwiches, or you might go out to dinner. It's so important. So I would say that, write down the things that you're missing right now, I think the group who are struggling the most, age-wise, are younger people, because so much of our learning was done at the knees of sort of, you know, learning from the office elders, and so having to sort of pick those things up has definitely suffered over the course of the lockdown. I don't think we can replace all of that digitally, if I'm candid.
Yeah, Bruce, are we office elders? You
Sorry about that.
never know, we might qualify. I'm pushing 40 now. And so, Bruce, thank you so much for that. And China, to your point, I actually think with younger people and mentoring, I've had I don't know, I would say a 60% increase in the number of, you know, guys and girls reaching out to myself, and I'm guessing Bruce as well. Actually, in a way, I'm more accessible now. And similarly, first time in my life, I've thought maybe I could do with a mentor actually. And I reached out to a couple of people that I normally wouldn't really dream of being able to get in touch with, cracking through, you know, normally 3 levels of PAs, just popping them a note on Twitter or LinkedIn. And actually 80% success rate of people getting back to you, because people are, I think, a little more humane now as well. It's the great equalizer, I think, the pandemic, one of the positives of it. Bruce, thank you so much for this. We're
Thank
at the
you so
30-minute
much.
mark. So let's start to call it a day. Thank you everyone for watching. And Bruce, I really want to keep an eye on your new book. In fact, someone said, can you tell us the name of your book if you have one, and where we can order from?
Yeah, it's not out yet. I mean, if you are, I do a newsletter which is eatsleepworkrepeat.com. So if you are interested in any of the stuff I've talked about, it's work in progress, but it'll probably be out end of the year. Sorry, that's how these things work.
I'll have you back for another session then. For those of you watching who want to learn more about Bruce and I for future events, do pop a note to the wonderful folks at the London Speaker Bureau. Everyone, thank you. I'll sign off in newscaster style, so there used to be a broadcaster in London. This is Shivi Jervis and Bruce Daisley. Thank you all for listening.